Hi, everyone. Mark Fewer here from Stratford Summer Music. I'm joined today by my friend Tom Allen, who's in his rather Siberian-looking cage inside the CBC studios. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Mark.
So I wanted to talk a little bit today about, knowing you now for a few years and seeing all the great things that you've done and knowing how many, different pies you've got fingers in, as they say. Are there things at this point in your life that you creatively haven't really done yet that you're really itching to do, or things that are still interesting you and paths that are opening up that you're wanting to follow? I mean, I'm always kind of interested in this issue because I'm now in my 40s and I'm at a point where I am thinking about what's next and what I haven't done yet that I want to get done. I wouldn't say that I've ever sat down and made a list, but my brain certainly operates that fashion once in a while, trying to figure that out. I'm wondering, is that something that you think about, or the things you haven't done yet that you really want to invest in?
Yes, I would say now in my late 50s that, Mark, you should expect more and more of those thoughts in the coming years. I think about it all the time. And there are a few things there's a book that I'm quarter done that I would like to finish. And I'm enjoying playing the trombone a lot now, which wasn't the case for a very long time in the middle of my career. I'm not sure what had to happen. I think I just had to relax about it a little more and not ask the trombone to carry so much of my creative life. But I'm enjoying playing, and the combination of telling stories and playing the trombone and feeling a story lead the way. This is sort of a new thing for me. For years, I've heard authors talk about their characters, telling them what has to happen, and then listening to their characters. And I haven't really honestly had that experience until just recently, where I start to see that I don't need to drive the bus anymore. I don't need to push things to happen. I just have to allow them to happen and let that story tell me what it is. So I want to explore that. I want to spend more time working on that.
It's an interesting thing. I often have people ask me how much, because I like to do a variety of different things in music, people will say, oh, well, how much classical do you play, and how much jazz do you play, and how much early music do you play, and how much of this do you do? And the truth is, I've never really sat down to try and plan that out. It's just kind of
right.
the way it's happened. And I could maybe look back in hindsight and say, so that's how that happened. But it's not like I'm actively pursuing something. At least I haven't up to this point. But there are some things I guess I'd like to do that would require me to carve out some time for myself away from my regular schedule. And, that, again, because music is in some ways both a very personal and a very communal experience, that means I'd have to carve out time alone for a while, which is difficult, which is not something that's easily done with our fast lives and with family lives, all that.
And I think what happens when you do that, that gets into that territory of trying to steer what's going to happen. It takes a lot of confidence and sort of stability to give yourself some time and be willing to accept that maybe nothing's going to come from it. And I think it's only when you really accept that something does come from it. It's a really interesting counterintuitive thing, but I'm starting to experience that, and it's very exciting.
It's the great paradox of it all, isn't it? And I was in another interview, I was talking with Lucas Dan, the pianist who just released his second album, and it was released maybe 5 days ago, I think, and it's already got a review where he's being compared to Chick Corea and Chick Corea's album, Thelonious Monk. It's kind of ridiculous.
Wow.
One of the phrases we talked about was, and this is something I think about all the time, or I should say more and more as I get older, is honesty as fuel. And so, if you are inside playing a solo, and it's your turn to blow in a jazz tune, where do you start from? And are you really being honest with the notes that are coming out of the instrument? And you've got a form that you have to fill. You have a certain number of measures, or a certain number of times through those measures. So maybe you have to fill up 90 seconds, maybe you have to fill up 2.5 minutes, whatever it is. Can you stay honest in all of that time? And that, for me, it's an interesting idea, because I know from some friends of mine in the jazz world that they say, yeah, that's the goal, but sometimes you can't keep going, and you have to rely on stuff you already know to fill in the time, as it were. So A great piece of advice, not that I've really followed it well enough, but a great piece of advice Phil Dwyer once gave me, the great Canadian jazz saxophone and jazz legend. He said, yeah, you should find out 12 different ways to get from here to here, and know that you've got 12 different ways to get from here to here. And then you should be okay. If you're in the moment and you've got no exit door, suddenly you've got 12 exits you could use. And that's
well, and I think a life spent in performing. There are times early on, and I'm not suggesting Lucas Dan is an astonishing talent, but when you're younger, you don't necessarily need those 12 ways. You can just launch in and find one. But then over time, something happens, and you need to have more of a structure there. And then once in a while, the space opens up, and you don't need any of those 12. I think it only happens after you've got them all in your pocket, right. And then something happens, and there's a freedom that you stumble into, and it happens in story writing. It happens on the radio for me, and happens in music. There's something that connects. It's like this epiphanic moment. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, but it's you have to hang on to those and let them get you from one to the next one.
Say, do you play any other instrument outside of trombone?
Not really. I mean, I sort of plunk at the piano, and I have a mandolin that Lori gave me years ago that I sort of play, but not really.
Right.
No. I mean, I what is it now? Probably 25 years ago, I realized that the way my mind works, that stories were the thing that I did best. And so everything else has sort of followed that.
Right. I ask because, I play a little bit of piano, tiny bit of piano.
Mm-hmm.
I do play some saxophone from time to time. And it's an interesting thing to discover that when you're approaching an instrument, you can have all the theory in the world that you want. But in fact, there's an ergonomic, physical reality between you and the instrument that has to be respected.
Yeah.
And that means that what I do on the saxophone, if I'm ever doing that in public, which doesn't happen very often, but if I do something on saxophone, it's not the same me as me on violin. It's like
right, which is weird.
Yeah,
which is really strange.
Right. So I guess I wonder, with all the time you've spent crafting and allowing your mind to kind of craft stories. And you were mentioning just earlier that you're enjoying coming back to the trombone a lot more now.
Yeah.
Are those two separate processes for yourself, or are they connected on some level?
Well, I think it's a subconscious connection, but it's something that I want to explore more. And it actually came up with singing, because in the shows that Lori and I and our friends Bryce and Trish do, I often am singing some sort of background part, and I thought, well, if I'm singing, I should work on my voice. So I went for some voice lessons with this very good teacher in Toronto, and she heard me sing, and she wasn't really that impressed at first, and then she watched a video of me telling a story, one of the sort of single shot videos, and she said, oh, do that. Stop trying to sing, just do that when you sing. And it was a really interesting awareness to see that there was a completely different approach. Like you say, it's a different ergonomic relationship with the process. And now, so when I sing, I try to do that. I try to just tell a story. And, obviously it's going to be a long-term learning process. But yeah, I've done exactly that.
It's funny. I think I've told you before. In fact, I'm sure I've told you before about this piece that Bramwell Tovey had written for me, where I have to recite Shakespeare in the middle of this performance. And in preparation of this piece, I went to get some training with a really great acting coach in Vancouver named Dean Paul Gibson. Big shout out to him. I love that guy. I never see him. It's a sad thing, but he's such a great positive energy. And when I would go have lessons with him, there I am looking at Shakespearean texts, which I don't understand well anyway. And by the time I would finish a lesson with him, I would leave his place and I'd be walking down the street with a confidence chip on my shoulder, and that would last for 3 days. And then I'd call him up, I need another lesson. But what I learned after all that time with him, and what I think the gold he gave me, was that, the words are basically nothing. The words are just the words. And in fact, until you choose an emotional standpoint from which to deliver the words won't have any flow at all. And I think about that when it comes to music, without words, of course, because I play fiddle most of the time. When you're telling a story through music that's an abstract story, it's still from an emotional standpoint. Therefore, you're communicating hopefully to the listener, something from that position through pure sound rather than just word.
Right, and your brain is engaged in that narrative process. There's something unspooling. My friend John Shack in New York, who's also an acting coach and director, he used to call it following the rabbit. I don't know if he ever actually followed rabbits when he was a kid growing up on a farm, probably. But the idea that there's something there leading you on and you cannot lose sight of it. You have to, even if you're not right behind it, you've got to have your eye on that rabbit. And it takes you through the story or the fiddle music you're playing or the Shakespearean verse that you're reciting, whatever it is, there's a thread that needs to be respected. Right. And if you can do that, then it almost doesn't matter. It almost doesn't matter whether you get the words right. I mean, I remember hearing Maureen Forrester talk about that, about singing, brand new music that she'd have pieces written for her. And the first performance, was always going to be trying in terms of accurately getting all of these sometimes atonal notes. It was a really demanding thing. And she didn't quite say the notes don't matter, but it was pretty close. It was more the gesture and following the rabbit. If she could do that, then all of those notes would make sense. And eventually over time, they'd become both. They'd become both an accurate and a satisfying performance. But at the beginning, those two things are not necessarily the same.
So, hey, I was having a conversation with another guy who's coming up as a resident artist this year from San Francisco, Steve Prutzman, who's a really fascinating and brilliant pianist. And we were talking about cross-pollinating projects, as it were, and he's interested in, finding ways to make visual image and music work well together on a level that we probably haven't yet seen or see very rarely. And it connects to what we're talking about in some ways, in that, if you try too hard with one of the forms or with one of the outputs, like the music output, then the visual image will suffer. If you try too hard with the visual image, then the music might suffer. And finding a way to somehow balance those things. So I'm just interested, when you are putting together one of your shows, like let's say Bohemians, or any of the other shows you've got going, like I know we did this fun show of yours together, the last Curlew.
Right.
You're putting all those elements together. Is there some kind of driving force behind that, where you think, oh, wait a second, maybe we have to stop the music here, or we have to stop the word here, or is there a way in which that happens for you in the creative process?
Yeah, that does, and it's a very intuitive thing. I haven't got any kind of formula to explain that, but we all, these shows, I end up writing the story and then we add music, and sometimes that music is collaboratively created, and other times it's pre-existing music, or it's a mixture of all those things. But there's just a sense that, okay, we need music now, or we need the story. We can't let the story drop too far. It's got to, because it's two. I think it is two different parts of our brain. I think we process music on a very deeper, older part of our brain than a narrative story. And there's something in our intellectual curiosity that needs to be satisfied by the story, but at the same time, it has to connect with that really deep animal, emotional, musical brain. And to keep them both actively interested is a balancing act. And there's just a sense that I start to feel that we're losing one side, and so we have to go and try to remedy that. And sometimes it's even just a tiny little snippet of music. The merest few seconds, a musical gesture will satisfy that feeling, that emotional need, and then we can continue with the story. But as I say, I haven't come up with any kind of formula. I just know there's a feeling, and we all kind of get it. We all feel it.
Feeling is everything when it comes to the musical art. I mean, my old friend, now deceased sadly, Peter Longworth, we used to go years ago together to see films regularly, and we'd go see popular films all the time. And Peter used to say jokingly, we'd sit down in the theater and he'd have a big bag of popcorn or something, and he'd go, "All right, manipulate me." And because he would love it as an experience, the visual image and all the sound, with could be a Tarantino film that he really liked or whatever it was, but he really was interested in that experience. And I think, and I am too. I get off on that stuff for sure. I love it. But there's a way in which I feel like an audience that wants to be enriched by an experience to a live event it is a sensory event. Even if it's just a solo instrument playing a musical line with no words, it's still a sensory event. And maybe there's another version with people singing words. Maybe there's some story with it. Maybe there's a visual element on a screen somewhere. All those are activating senses on some deep level. And I actually feel personally that as the world continues to want to be more visual, that sometimes is it ends up having a negative impact on our oral senses, so much so that we're not training them to the level they used to be. A classic example was given to me by Leslie Ting. I don't know if you know Leslie Ting, but I was interviewing her. She's got this great show called Speculation that's coming to Stratford, which talks about her mother losing her sight over the last 2 years of her life. And we were talking about this whole thing about visual versus oral. And she said, well, have you ever noticed that if you're driving in a car and you're listening to the radio and all of a sudden it starts to pour down rain, you turn the radio down in order to be able to feel safer behind the wheel? You ever know? And I thought to myself, yeah, I've actually experienced exactly that before. So in other words, there's a sensory need on some level, which is oral one in that environment for survival. So you need to survive this. Turn that down. I've got to listen to what's going on outside. That kind of thing as something to
that's great.
I mean, that's like a path for an audience to experience something and hopefully feel enriched by the experience, which is, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I think that's true. I mean, we're ultimately we want to be immersed in as many of our senses, as possible. The other thing that's coming to mind is a conversation I had with a conductor about how it is that conductors, generally speaking, live longer than anybody else. There are exceptions, but I can think of many very long-lived conductors. And I thought, well, it must be because of cardiovascular health. It must be that they're standing up so much of the time and using their arms, which is a very healthy kind of respiratory, circulatory activity. And he said, yeah, that's true. But there are few professions where your body and your mind and your spirit are all equally engaged and equally needed in your activity. And that if you engage all of those aspects of your person in something that is worthwhile to you, then it's going to further your life. You're going to have a better life. So I think that the things we're talking about of visual art and storytelling and music, I mean, they're all along these same lines. They're all spiritual and physical and musical and emotional. All of these things engaged at the same time. If you can experience that, especially with other people as a community event, it's going to be good. It's going to be better.
Have you seen that latest study out of the UK that says by going to concerts twice a month, your longevity could go up by 9 years?
I missed that. That's interesting. 9 years.
I think that's incredible, and I understand like this whole issue of like engaging all of your senses in some kind of communal fashion that is joyous, finally, and enriching. Like, yeah, that could.
So then, what if I just lived my expected lifetime and then I started going to concerts for 9 years straight? Would that work too?
Yeah, probably some way in which this is unfortunately like smoking. I don't think that would really work. Yeah. Well, look, Tom, it's been a pleasure chatting, and I really do look forward to having you in Stratford soon. And I can't wait to have a chance to sit down and let my senses be taken over by everything you're going to give us. So,
all right, thanks, Mark.
Today, and look forward to seeing you.
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled to be part of Stratford Summer Music. It's going to be great. Thank you.